Section number 42 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix, The Countess de Murat, by James Planché. Henriette Julie de Castelnau, daughter of Michel, 2nd Marquis de Castelnau, governor of Brest, and granddaughter by the mother's side to the Count d'Aignan, Marshal of France, was born at Brest in 1670. At the age of 16 she came to Paris in the costume worn by the peasants in Brittany, the language of which province she spoke very fluently. Her appearance in this dress caused such a sensation that the Queen desired her to wear it on her presentation at court. She married Nicholas, Count de Murat, Colonel of Infantry and Brigadier d'Armes de Roy, descended from a family established in Auvergne before 1300, and that afterwards passed into Dauphine. Being suspected by Madame de Maintenon of having been part author of a libel in which all the persons composing the court of Louis XIV in 1694 were caricatured or insulted, she was banished to Auc Department de Jure after the death of Louis XIV, the Regent Duke of Orleans, at the request of Madame de Parabère, recalled Madame de Murat in 1715. She did not, however, long enjoy her return to Paris, as she died at her Château Bazdières in Maine the following year, 1716, at the early age of 46. She was the author of many works, both in prose and verse, but is best known by her Contes de Fées, 6 of the most popular of which are here translated. 4 of these, Le Parfait Armoire, Anguillette Jeune et Belle, and Le Palais de la Vengeance, were printed in 1766, and again in 1817, in the collection of fairy tales attributed to the Countess d'Aulnoy, of whom Madame de Murat was the contemporary, but certainly not the rival. Her stories have more the character of romances and novels than fairy tales, with a strong infusion of sentiment, such as to be found in the writings of Madame de Ségoudry, Mademoiselle de Lafayette, the Countess d'Auquenil, and others of that period. The plots of them were most probably taken from Les Contes Ingénieux quelquefois remplis de l'adresse qu'ont inventé de la troubadours, for to this she is specially invited in the verses at the end of the prose story of L'Adroite Princesse, which is dedicated to her and attributed to Perrault. It has been shown, however, that if that version of L'Adroite Princesse were really written by him, it was not published till 1742, 39 years after the death of the reputed author, and 26 after the death of the lady to whom it is dedicated. Perfect Love. Le Parfait Armoire is a story exhibiting considerable talent, although deficient in those lively sallies, those amusing whimsicalities and allusions to the manners and dresses of the period which give so much piquancy to the fairy tales of Perrault, and the more elaborate compositions of Madame d'Aulnoy. The interest is entirely of a serious character, but the magic ring, with its power over the 4 elements, the value of which is destroyed by the too hasty wish of the lover, is an ingenious and dramatic idea, and the fatal lamps a true affecting situation. This is the first fairy tale that gives us a picture of the gnomes, and their subterraneous magnificence, a superstition existing all over Europe. The trolls, or underground men of the north, the little people and the ground mannikins of Germany, and the core or corrid of Brittany. The wise and prudent little people who keep warm, by their fine fires, many a fathom down, within the inmost rocks, pure native gold, and the rock crystals, shaped like towers, clear, transparent, gleam with colours thousandfold, through the fair palace, and the little folks, so happy and so gay, amuse themselves, sometimes with singing. And accordingly we find them singing the charms of Irolite, and entertaining the lovers with une musique fort harmonieuse, mais un peu barbare. Anguillette. Anguillette is a story of the same character as Le Parfait Amour. The interest is wholly serious, and the termination tragical, reminding one, by the transformation of the victims into trees, of the catastrophe of the Yellow Dwarf of Madame d'Aulnoy. The inconsistency of Atmire is very naturally drawn, and there is considerable merit in the general conduct of the story. Young and handsome. Jeune et Belle might almost be placed amongst the pastoral romances of D'Urfey and George de Montemayor. It is full of Watteau-like tableaux, many of them suggested, probably, to the writer as to the painter of the Fête Champêtre, so much in vogue during the 17th and 18th centuries as the Court of Versailles. The sudden and unexpected introduction of Zephyr at the very close of the story as the Deus ex machina is quite in accordance with the taste of the period, though much out of place in a fairy tale. It is not, however, for me to find fault with it, as it afforded me a hint for a character which enabled Mr. Robson to display the versatility of his genius in the last of that long series of extravaganzas I have already alluded to. In the collection above mentioned, this tale was substituted for Madame d'Aulnoy's Serpentin Verte, the denouncement of which is also produced by the congruous introduction of mythological personages. The Palace of Vengeance. Le Palais de Vengeance was printed in the collection as Madame d'Aulnoy's under the title of The Palace of Revenge. It is principally remarkable for its satirical conclusion, a very original one for a fairy tale, as the lovers are married, and do not live happily ever afterwards. The Prince of Leaves. Leprince de la Feuille is, to my best of knowledge, presented for the first time in an English garb. It is more of a fairy tale than the four preceding it, and appears to me to have been suggested to Madame de Murat by her residence at Auch, which indeed is most likely to have been written. The natural history of the turquoise has been newly popularized by the publications of Chardin and other oriental travellers, and more particularly by that of a book by Boethius de Boot, Le Parfait Joliet, Lyons, 1644. The turquoise de la Ville Roche that Madame de Murat speaks of is a stone found near Nishapur and Khorasan in Persia, the true oriental turquoise, whilst those called de la Nouvelle Roche are not stones, but petrified bones, and are found in Europe, particularly in France, at Auch. the very place to which Madame de Murat was exiled, and near Sinmour in the Department du Gers and in the Nivernais, according to the account of Reaumur in the Memoires de l'Académie, 1715. Turquoises were formerly very highly prized, and all kinds of virtues and properties attributed to them, the greater part of which are fabulous, although detailed gravely by De Boot, who was physician to Rodolph II., Emperor of Germany. The jewellers, even in his day, took great pains to distinguish between those that retained their colour and those that turned green. A fine unchanging turquoise, the size of a filbert, sold in that day for 200 thalers and upwards. The turquoise possesses such attractions, says De Boot, that men do not think their hands are well adorned, nor their magnificence sufficiently displayed, if they are not decked with some of their finest. The name is supposed to have been derived from Turkey, the country from which they were probably first imported, but others deduce it from Turchino, a name given by Italians to a particular blue. Even at this day the discoloration or loss of a turquoise is considered a prognostication of evil. The fortunate punishment. Le Heureuse Peine is also, I believe, new to the English reader. It is an exceedingly graceful story, and denouncement is novel as well as ingenious. The little animal in which the unfortunate Naimée is transformed is not specified by the author, but from an allusion to its manière de marcher, I suppose it to be a crayfish, a favourite with the writers of fairy tales. End of section 42. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section number 43 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix. Mademoiselle de la Force by James Planché. Charlotte Rose de la Force was the daughter of François de Caumont, Marquis de Castelmoron, and granddaughter of Jacques de Caumont, Duc de la Force, whose escape from the massacre of St. Bartholomew is celebrated in the Henriade of Voltaire, and whose afterwards greatly signalized himself by his exploits during the reign of Henry IV. And Louis VIII. She was born in the castle at Castelneuve, near Basse, in Guinea, about 1650, and died in Paris in 1724. Her mother, Marguerite de Vicoff, was Dame de Castelneuve and daughter of the Baron de Castelnau. Mademoiselle de la Force would therefore appear to be maternally connected with Madame de Murat. She is said to have been married in 1687 to Charles de Brion, but that the marriage was declared null and void 10 days afterwards. She was the author of several memoirs and romances, and of an epistle, in verse, to Madame de Maintenon, but is best known by her fairy tales, Contes de Contes, though only one of them has, to my knowledge, appeared previously in English. That one is Fairer Than a Fairy. Plus Belle que Fée was published, with the usual abridgments and alterations, about 20 years ago, in a collection of nursery tales. The story bears a strong resemblance to the Gracieuse and Penchant of the Countess d'Aulnoy, and although the plot is rendered more intricate by the addition of another pair of lovers, It does not gain in interest as much as it loses in coherence and simplicity. The fair author has, however, appended a note to her story called L'Enchanteur, which forbids us to suppose that she was indebted to any previous writer for the plot of her story. She says, "This story, L'Enchanteur, is taken from an ancient romance, ancien livre Gothique, named Perceval, several things being omitted which were not in accordance with our modern tastes, and several others added. Some names are changed. It is the only story that is not entirely the composition of the author. All the others are purely of her invention." After this positive declaration, which we have no right to question, why should we refuse to give credit to the Countess d'Aulnoy for the possession of equal powers of imagination? I am by no means impugning the originality of Plus Belle de Fille, in pointing out that the notion of the Fair of Time seems to have been suggested by an old fairy legend of Normandy. Near the village of Puy, half a league to the northeast of Dieppe, there is a high plateau, surrounded on all sides by high entrenchments, except that over the sea, where the cliffs render it inaccessible. It is named La Cité de Limes, or Le Camp de César, or simply Le Catel, or Castel. Tradition tells that the Fees used to hold a fair there, at which all sorts of magic articles from their secret stores were offered for sale, and the most courteous entreaties and blandishments were employed to induce those who frequented it to become purchasers; but the moment any one did so, and stretched forth his hand to take the article he had selected, the perfidious Fees seized him, and hurled him down the cliffs. I cannot say that Mademoiselle de la Force had made the most of this tradition, supposing her to have been acquainted with it. Her allusion to the entertainments at Marly, to which alone she says this fair was to be compared, has reference, I think, to a fancy fair, as we should call it, in which the stalls were attended, as in our days, by the principal personages of the court. I feel satisfied that I have somewhere seen an account of that entertainment, but unfortunately have no note which would enable me to turn to the authority. The Good Woman. La Bonne Femme is far superior to Plus Belle que Fille. It is indeed worthy of Madame d'Aulnoy, and I cannot account for it never having previously met with a translator. It will be recognized by playgoers as the foundation of my fairy extravaganza, The Good Woman in the Wood, in which form the dramatic incidents of this charming story were first introduced to a London public. As we are bound, after the author's declaration, to consider it an original story, we need not trouble ourselves to hunt after its source. The other original fairy tales, Percinet, Tourbillon, Vert et Bleu, Le Pays de Délices, and Le Poisson d'Armoire, bear no comparison to the two I have selected. End of section 43. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section number 44 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix. Madame de Villeneuve by James Planché. Gabrielle Susan Barbeau, daughter of a gentleman of Rochelle, and widow of Monsieur de Galland, Seigneur de Villeneuve, lieutenant colonel of infantry, died at Paris in the house of Surbriant. The tragic writer, December 29th, 1755. Such is the sum of the information afforded us by editors and biographers concerning the author of one of the most popular fairy tales ever written. The Beauty and the Beast. La Belle et la Bête. Thousands of English readers have no doubt been all their lives under the impression that they knew nearly by heart the story of Beauty and the Beast, and though few, alas, may have taken the trouble to inquire who was the author of it, those who have imagined themselves indebted for it to Madame Leprince de Beaumont. Nay, there are many, no doubt, in France, who are under the same belief, for La Belle et la Bête par Madame Leprince de Beaumont is without a word of explanation at this moment circulating as a portion of the French Railway Library, and was published, with various other stories, in a small edition of Contes de Fées only last year, under her name, by a bookseller on the Quai d'Augustin, Paris. It is only those who have read the original story by Madame de Villeneuve, either in the Contes Marins or in the Cabinet de Fées, who will not be surprised to find that Madame Beaumont has merely the merit of having cut this admirable work down to the smallest comprehensible dimensions, and made a pretty little nursery tale of one of the most ingeniously constructed stories in the whole catalogue of fairy chronicles. The story of the Beast is but alluded to in few words, and that of the real parents of Beauty altogether is omitted. It is no answer to say that the version by Madame Beaumont is an agreeable story, that the moral is preserved, and that there are portions of the original tale which required alteration or omission. In justice to Madame Villeneuve, it ought never to be printed without the acknowledgment that it is simply an abridgment of her composition, adjusted to the use of juvenile readers, by Madame Beaumont. I have omitted a dozen lines, and softened one objectionable expression, but, with the exception of this very slight and indispensable alteration, Madame de Villeneuve's story is now placed before the English public in its entirety. It was published in 1740, and Mr. Dunlop remarks, "It surpasses all that has been produced by the lively and fertile imaginations of France or Arabia." But in his notice of the tales of Perrault, he says that it is an expansion of and adoption from Riquet de la Houpe. I think this is one of those hasty conclusions of which we are all occasionally guilty. I cannot, for my part, see any resemblance between the two stories. In Riquet, an ugly and deformed prince wins the hand of a lovely princess, the usual triumph of mind over matter; but in Beauty and the Beast the suitor is not merely a repulsive man, but a monster of the most horrible and tremendous description, and who is specially prohibited from availing himself of those mental powers which might in the slightest degree affect the judgment of a lady. Pity and gratitude are the motives which influence Beauty to sacrifice her own happiness to ensure that of the Beast. In the other case, admiration of the talent of Riquet renders the princess gradually blind to the defects of his person. Le Mouton of Madame d'Aulnoy offers indefinitely more points of resemblance. The transformation of the king into a ram by a jealous and vindictive fairy, and the permission given to him by Merveilleuse to visit her family, on her solemnly promising to return by a stated period, are features too obvious to be overlooked. The despair of the ram in consequence of her not fulfilling her promise on the last occasion is also like that of the monster, but Madame de Villeneuve has avoided the tragic catastrophe, and notwithstanding the similarity I've pointed out, Beauty and the Beast, taken as a whole, deserves all the praise that those who are best acquainted with it have unanimously accorded to it. It is a curious circumstance that the Gatta Centralonia of Basile and the German version of Cinderella both commence with the departure of the father on a journey, and the requests of his daughters correspondingly exactly in their general character with those in Beauty and the Beast, while we find nothing in the sort of Perrault's Cendrillon. I infer from this that the Italian and German writers have mixed two old stories together, and that Madame de Villeneuve is founded on one of them. End of section 44. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section 45 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix. The Count de Caylus by James Planché. Anne-Claude de Toubière de Grimaude de Pastil de Lévis, Comte de Caylus, was born in Paris in 1692, and died the 3rd of September, 1765. He entered the French army early, and distinguished himself in Catalonia and at the siege of Freiburg. After the peace of Rissault, he visited Italy, and in 1717 went to the Levant in the suite of the ambassador of France to the Sublime Porte. During this journey he undertook an adventure which proves his courage as well as his love of art. On arriving at Smyrna, he was anxious to profit by the necessary delay of a few days to visit the ruins of Ephesus, which are about 12 hours' journey from that place. The neighbourhood was at that time infested by a band of brigands, the chief of which was the notorious and terrible Caracayoli. The roads were exceedingly unsafe for travellers, but the Count de Caylus was not to be daunted. He provided himself with a dress made simply of sailcloth, and carrying nothing about him that could tempt the most petty thief, he sought out 2 of the band of Caracayoli, and bargained with them for a safe conduct from Smyrna to Ephesus, and back again, the money to be paid only on his return. It being their interest to take care of him, he found them the most faithful guides in the world. Caracayoli, on learning the object of his journey, politely offered to assist his researches. He informed the Count that in the neighbourhood of his retreat there were some ruins well worthy his inspection, and to expedite his visit to them, he mounted him and one of his guides on 2 fine Arabian horses. The ruins proved to be those of Colophon. The Count returned to the retreat of Caracayoli and passed the night there, and the next morning proceeded to the site of the ancient city of Ephesus, from whence he was safely conducted back to Smyrna by the brigands, each party well satisfied with their bargain. After his return to France in 1717, he made several other journeys abroad, and paid 2 visits to London. At Paris he occupied himself with drawing, music, painting, writing, and sculpture. He wrote the lives of the most celebrated painters and sculptors of the Royal Academy, and founded in that Academy an annual prize for the students who were the most successful in expressing the passions. In 1742 he was elected an honorary member of l'Académie des Inscriptions, in which he founded another prize of 500 livres for the best essays on the manners and customs of the ancients. He formed a splendid collection of Etruscan, Greek, Roman, and Gaulish antiquities, and an account of which was published, 7 volumes, 4 chapters, the last in 1767, by Monsieur Lebeau. He discovered the ancient art of encaustic painting, and of tingling marble, from hints in the works of the elder Pliny. But all this occupation and study did not prevent this eminent scholar and antiquary from indulging in the lighter pursuits of literature. He did not disdain to acknowledge the fascination of a fairy tale, or to contribute to the number of them. I have selected 3 from his Féeries Nouvelles, which are in my judgment the best, and display the greatest variety of style and power of imagination. The first, Princess Minute and King Floridor. La Princesse Minute et le Roi Floridor is written in a spirit of playful satire, which reminds one of those sprightly characters of fairy tales which flowed so pleasantly from the pen of Count Hamilton. But unlike La Bellière and Le Fleur d'Épine of that accomplished satirist, Princess Minute and King Floridor presents us with a sound and serious morale, which at this moment, when the sacrifice of important interests to routine and etiquette has caused so much animadversion, is singularly apropos. It also reads a pleasant lesson to those who neglect or misuse the great means and opportunities which it has pleased Providence to bestow upon them, and amidst all its whimsical extravagances never ceases to whisper in the words of Solomon, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways to be wise." Floridor was the name of a celebrated French actor of the 17th century. In Le Temple du Destin, written by Le Sage, and acted at the fair of St. Laurent in 1715, the high priest of destiny observes upon the vanity of an actor, "Tout ce qui reluit n'est pas or il a tout ce génie. Chacun se croit un Floridor, la plaisante manie." The Impossible Enchantment. L'Enchantement Impossible is an amusing story with one blemish, which I have ventured to correct by the omission of half a dozen lines, and the suppression of an unnecessary indelicacy. Unlike the last, this is a mere work of fancy, without any particular object, a sort of illustration of the old song and saying, "Love will find out the way." The Merman and his sister would seem to point out a Breton origin for this story, as the belief in these marine marvels is strong upon the coast of Brittany, where the females are called Morgan, sea women, or Morvdie, sea daughters, and are supposed to draw down to their places of gold and crystal at the bottom of the ocean those who venture imprudently too near the edge of the water; but the Count de Caylus was too well acquainted with the classical Tritons and Sirens to render it necessary for him to draw upon the legends of Armorica for such materials, and it is probable the story is entirely of his own invention. The absurd fashions in hairdressing, glanced at in this story by the introduction of a fairy with her hair dressed en chien-fou, are commented upon in a little volume called Histoire de la Mode Française, Amsterdam and Paris, 1773. The number of these frissures, says the writer, is almost infinite. Every year, every month, produces new ones. We have seen, in succession, hair dressed en bequille, crutch fashion, un grain d'épards, spinach fashion, en bâton repos, broken stick. Yesterday it was un aile de pigeon, to-day it is un debacle. Bluet and Coquelicot. Bluet and Coquelicot is a charming fairy tale of the pastoral order, unexceptionable in its style, and salutary in its instruction. I have only to add, in further illustration of the headdress of Arganto, page 360, that the foreign Marchal powder was advertised in 1781 at 16s. per pound by R. Languine, at the sign of the Rose, opposite New Round Court, Strand, and that receipts for making it occur as late as in Gray's Supplement to the Pharmacopoeia in 1836. The author of L'Histoire du Mode Français, quoted above, says he does not despair of one day seeing rose-coloured hair powder, blue heads, etc., and in Plocanemos, 1781, we actually find receipts for making yellow, rose pink, and black hair powder, while Goldsmith, in his Citizen of the World, letter 3, mentions both black and blue. End of section 45. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section 46 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix, Mademoiselle de Lubert, by author James Planché. Of this lady we have but very meagre information. She was born about the year 1710, and is said by some writers to have been the daughter of a president, and by others of a trésorier de marine. She appears to have led a studious and retired life, her love of literature indisposing her to marriage. Her contes de filles were commenced about 1740, and several have been attributed to her pen which she disavowed. Those she acknowledged were Tesserion, La Princesse Lionette, et Le Prince Coquereau, Le Prince Glace, et La Princesse Incolente, La Princesse Couleur de Rose, et Le Prince Celadron, La Princesse Camillon, and La Nouvelle Lionelle. She was also the author of a translation of Amadis de Gaul, Les Hautes Fêtes d'Esplandian, and Anecdotes Africaines, published in 1752. Voltaire and Fontenelle called her Muse and Grace. She was living in 1772 and died before 1779. She had disappeared from society for some time previously, and was presumed to be still living at that date, but a letter written by some one who knew of her decease, inserted in the Journal de Paris of that year, No. 69, addressed to the author of L'Almanach des Dames Illustres, by L'Ombre de la Mademoiselle de Lubert, and dated from the mill in une bosette de Champs-Élysées, seems to have been considered sufficient authority, though as no precise time or place is mentioned, the letter might have been written by the lady herself, had she wished to deceive the public. She had, however, reached a very respectable age, and it is probable that she was dead at that period. Her contes de filles, remarks one of her critics, we are not nearly equal to those of Mademoiselle de Murat, and other ladies who have written in that style. They have less of moral purpose and allegorical allusion. This is quite true, and my object in publishing the two I have selected is to illustrate, as I have mentioned in my preface, the decline of the fairy tale. Mademoiselle de Lubert is one of the latest of her class. Her stories are only designed to amuse. The publication of The 1001 Nights by Galland and the immense popularity that work immediately obtained evidently affected the composition of fairy tales. Wild, extravagant adventures, unconnected incidents, transformations without point or object, a straining after merely marvellous, and a total abandonment of the laughing philosophy and the unaffected morality which distinguish and immortalize the stories of Perrault and d'Aulnoy, were the first effects of the circulation of the Arabian Nights entertainments. The next was the orientalizing of every tale of enchantment. Dull caliphs and sultans disposed the merry old kings, who, once upon a time, ruled in fairyland. The amours of the seraglio and the harem were substituted for the innocent courtships of princes or shepherds. The manners and dresses of the time, those delicious anachronisms which impart so much pleasantry, and instruction to the fairy tale, were carefully avoided, and the characters, arrayed in what the writers flattered themselves were Eastern costumes, were seriously placed in situations compared to which that of Molaire's Monsieur Jourdain at Mamemochi was a nearer approach to reality. Even those that had some claim to Oriental origin were so altered and manufactured for the European market that they were said to appear en sortant de chez Barbin, plus Arabe qu'en Arabie. Le Mercure Galant was flooded with these productions. Almanzor et Zurha, Conte Arabe, Alermine de Zelima, Conte Oriental, Balki, Conte Oriental, Zaman, Histoire Orientale, etc. Then we have Conte Mongol, Conte Turks, Conte Chinois, Conte Tartars, Conte Parsin, etc. But we are forgetting Mademoiselle de Lubert and her Princess Caméléon. A translation of La Princesse Caméléon, much abridged and altered, was published in the Child's Fairy Library some 20 years ago, under the title of Princess Minikin. The plot of this story is intricate without being ingenious. The persecution of Caméléon by Marmot is purely capricious, and her contrivances are of the clumsiest description. In the original, Zirphil is commanded to take off, one by one, the scales of the whale, but a whale has no scales that it could feel the deprivation of. It is skinning the fish alive that would be a cruel operation, and I have therefore rendered écorché in that sense, and not to scale, as it had been previously translated, in accordance with the specific direction quoted above. The transformation of the unfortunate princess into a crayfish, and her being shelled instead of pounded as Marmot had decreed, is all of the same character. The long story told by her in that state to the other crayfish in the plantation is a lame way of enlightening either Zirphil or the reader, and has to be continued in as lame a manner by Citronette. The pounding the crayfish for the king's soup, and the disappearance of them in flames when they are put into the mortar, seems to point to an Eastern origin. The latter portion reminds us of the black men flinging the fish into the fire, in the story of the Fisherman and the Genius, in the Arabian Nights, where there is also a city changed into a lake, and all its inhabitants into fishes, and re-transformed in the end, and restored to the rightful monarch, the young king of the Black Island. The crayfish broth may be an allusion to the well-known bisque écrevisse, but it is also an oriental dish, for while this book was passing through the press, a morning journal announced that the eldest royal son of His Majesty the First King of Siam, on his arrival at Claridge's Hotel, after satisfying himself that due provision had been made for the comfort of his staff, retired to rest, having first partaken of a frugal repast, prepared by his own chef de cuisine, consisting of crayfish pounded with various Eastern condiments. Morning Post, October 31st, 1857. The eagerness with which the nobles of the court sought for the servile office of filling the king of the Whiting's bowl with sea water is the only stroke of satire in the story, and evidently levelled at the candle holding and similar ceremonies of le grand et le petit coucher. To stand and hold a bougier allume while Louis XIV undressed himself was, says Saint Simon, une distinction et un faveur qui le sont complets, tant le roi avait l'art de donner l'être de la reine. In a note to the expression, shrieks like Neilson's, page 398, I have suggested that some portion of Princess Camion might have been founded on the romance of Melusine. This romance was composed towards the end of the 14th century by Jeanne d'Arc, at the desire of the Duke de Berry, son of John, King of France, and was founded on an incident recorded in the archives of the family of Wysk, which were in possession of the Duke. It is briefly as follows. The Legend of Melusine. A king of Albania, named Elenius, had married the beautiful Fay Presine, by whom he had 3 daughters at birth, Melusine, Melor, and Palatine. Fay had stipulated that he should never enter her chamber during the period of her confinement, but the king having broken his promise in his anxiety to embrace his newly born children, the queen cried out that she was compelled to leave him, and immediately disappeared with her 3 daughters. She retired to the court of her sister, the queen of the Isle Perdu, and as her children grew up, instructed them in the art of sorcery. Melusine, having learned from her mother the conduct of her father, determined to be revenged on him, and proceeding to Albania by means of her newly acquired art, carried off the king and shut him up in a mountain called Brandaloy. The queen, who still retained some affection for her husband, on becoming acquainted with this unnatural act, punished Melusine by sentencing her to become every Saturday a serpent from the waist downwards, till she should meet with a lover who would marry her on condition of never intruding on her during the time of her transformation, when she was ordered to bathe, with a promise that if she strictly attended to this injunction she might eventually be relieved from her weekly disgrace and punishment. Melusine was excessively beautiful, and Raymondin, son of the Count de Forez, having met with her in the forest of Colombier, fell in love with her so deeply that he married her without hesitation on the prescribed conditions. She built for him, near the spot where they had met, the castle of Lusignan, and bore him several children. But her husband's jealousy being excited by a cousin who suggested to him that Melusine had a criminal object in secreting herself on a Saturday, he made a hole with his sword in the door of the chamber to which she was wont to retire, and perceived her in her state of transformation. The various versions of this legend differ in the details of the consequences, but all agree in stating that Melusine, reproaching him with the breach of his word, disappeared and left him to end his days as a hermit on Montserrat. The popular belief was that she appeared on what was called the Tower of Melusine when any of the lords of Lusignan were about to die, and Mezeray assures us, on the faith of peoples who were not by any means credulous, that previous to the death of Lusignan or of a king of France, she was seen on this tower in the morning dress, and uttered for a long time the most heart-piercing lamentations. The Duke de Montpensier destroyed the castle in 1574, on account of the resistance made to his arms in it by the Huguenots, but the family of Lusignan, till it merged in that of Montmorency Luxembourg, continued to bear for its crest a woman bathing, in allusion to the story of Melusine. Aigne pour la figure, et serpent pour le reste. Delisle. Princess Lionette and Prince Coquelicot. La Princesse Lionette et le Prince Coquelicot is an infinitely better story than La Princesse Camion, but, like that, its aim is no higher than to excite the interest and awaken the wonder of its readers. As a work of fancy, however, it is one of the best of its class, and I believe it is now for the first time translated into English. I do not recollect any story on which it could be said to be founded, but at the end of Le Tyrannie de la Fille de Truet, by the Countess d'Aneuil, is a story, entitled La Princesse Lion, in which a princess is changed into a lioness, and persecuted by a fairy called La Rançonne, but there is the similarity ends. Mademoiselle de Lubert edited the edition of the Nouvelle Conte de la Fille of the Countess d'Aneuil, and may have taken an idea from that particular incident. The model of the globe in which Prince Coquerico saw and heard all that passed in the universe, and witnessed the opera, the play, and the orations at the Académie Française, reminds one of the room in the palace of the Beast, the various windows of which afforded Beauty similar entertainment. The fairy Tigrelin's employments of spinning and threading pearls is in strict accordance with the manners of the 16th century. Passions avec les dames, said Rabelais. Nostra vie et le notre temps à enfiler le père ou la fille, comme Sardanapalus. Livre et chapter 33. I have mentioned, page 438, that the opera of Armide was considered the chef d'oeuvre of Quinault. The music was composed by Lully, and it is reported that he made Quinault write the last act over again 5 times, which so disgusted the poet that he ceased to write for the stage from that period. The incident of the shield is that in which Ubaldo holds before Rinaldo his adamant or diamond shield, in which the latter sees himself reflected in his effeminate attire, is awakened to sense of his degraded situation, and abandons the enchanted gardens of Armida. Book 16. End of section 46. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Section 47 of 24 Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Appendix, Madame Leprince de Beaumont, by James Planché. Jean Leprince de Beaumont was born at Rouen in 1711, and commenced her literary career in 1748 by the production of a romance, called Le Triomphe de la Vérité, shortly after which she came to England and resided in London for a considerable time, occupying herself as a governess, and in writing works for the instruction as well as the amusement of youth. That which acquired the most popularity was Le Magazine d'Enfants, in which appeared her abridgment of Beauty and the Beast, and her original Fairy Tales. She was twice married. Her first was an unfortunate union, annulled almost immediately afterwards. Her second marriage took place in England, but to a Frenchman, and in 1762 she returned to France for the benefit of her native air. In 1768 she purchased a small estate, called Chenovi, and died in 1780. Her miscellaneous works amount to 70 volumes, but even Le Magazine d'Enfants is scarcely remembered in the present day, and the 4 short fairy tales which terminate this volume are, with the abridgment of Beauty and the Beast, the only effusions by which she is popularly known in England. The best of them is Prince Desire and Princess Mignonne. It is more like one of the good old Breton stories, pleasant, short, and with a sound moral. Prince Chéri, corrupted into Prince Cherry in our children's books, exhibits the influence of the importations from the East, but that it has so manifest a moral, it might pass for a French alteration of an Oriental tale. The names of Solomon and Zélie would encourage the suspicion. The Widow and her 2 daughters. La Veuve et ses 2 filles is better known by the title of Blanche et Vermillion, under which it has been frequently printed, and was also produced on the French stage by Monsieur Floridan in March 1781. The moral of the story is declared by the fairy to be that excessively trite and commonplace axiom, that happiness consists in content, or, in the words of the author, the possession of things only that are necessary without wishing for more. But the author forgot to show us that Blanche was discontented. It does not appear that she wished for superfluities, or to be a great queen, or that such an idea ever entered her head, till the fairy promised her she should become one, not to reward, but to punish her for begrudging to give away her plums. Poor Blanche is therefore made an unhappy queen. Her low birth renders her an object of contempt at court. The king is a worthless person, who neglects the innocent girl his passion induced him to place upon his throne, and who is the mother of his children, and at length the miserable wife exclaims that happiness is not to be found in magnificent palaces, but in the innocent occupations of the country. Now this is foolish. It is worse, for it is false and injurious. There is as much happiness in palaces and on thrones, thank God, as there is in cottages. The occupations of a virtuous sovereign are as innocent as those of a husbandman, while the power to do good, existing with the will, must make the balance of happiness greatly in favour of the former. The cares of state are burdensome enough, no doubt, and the more conscientious the monarch, the weightier the sense of responsibility. But has the countryman no cares, nor sorrows, no vices? The legal occupations of all classes are innocent. It is only kings and nobles who yield to temptations or indulge in the evil propensities of our common nature. There has been too much of this fallacy infused into what are called moral stories, and at the risk of being accused of breaking a butterfly on the wheel, I have singled out this particular instance, as Blanche and the Vermilion is to be found in almost every child's story book. That the author's intention was laudable, I do not doubt, but to read a wholesome lesson, she should have shown Blanche to have been discontented with the lot assigned to her by Providence, pining to mix in society for which she was neither fitted by birth nor education, and dreaming that happiness consisted solely in rank, wealth, and luxury. The moral should have been, not that such possessions were incompatible with virtue and happiness, but that their owners were not exempted from the fragilities and sufferings of humanity, and that unequal marriages were rarely fortunate ones. All this, it will be said, she might mean, but it is not evident, and the only impression made upon a child's mind by this story, if any impressions can be made by it whatever, is the very absurd and objectionable one, that all kings and queens are wicked and unhappy, and all farmers and dairymaids virtuous and contented. Prince Fatal and Prince Fortune. This is another of the moral fairy tales of Madame de Beaumont, and as Fatal and Fortune, a great favourite with the compilers of children's story books, it is healthier in tone than the preceding. The value of adversity is difficult to impress on a young mind, and is pointed out in this little tale as well, perhaps, as it could be. But there is one observation I must venture to make in reference to a point of taste. The writers of the old fairy tales never mix up the Almighty with fairies and enchanters. The superior powers are invariably the mythological divinities of ancient Greece and Rome. Their heroes and heroines pray to the gods, not to God. The introduction of the sacred name is, I am well aware, too frequent in familiar French conversation, to render it a matter of criticism in the original language, and I fully acquit Madame de Beaumont of any intentional irreverence, but it is a fact worthy of remark, that in an age and at a court where are described as particular licentious, the writers for youth or entertainment carefully abstained from an unnecessary profanity, of which they had examples enough in the older fabliaux and romances, not only of their own country but throughout Europe, and that although the majority of these authors were in the highest ranks of society, members of the circle that surrounded the throne of one of the most despotic monarchs in the civilized world, they never spared the foibles or the crimes of princes, or the hypocrisy and treachery of their parasites. The fearless frankness, indeed, with which they satirized the follies and invited against the vices of the great, is as honourable to them as their perfect freedom from that questionable morality which would deny in any class the existence of virtue and the enjoyment of happiness found upon it. Madame de Beaumont's admission that such may be the case concludes her story of Fatal and Fortune more satisfactory than her insinuation to the contrary does that of the widow and her two daughters. So much has been said in this appendix about Peau d'Ane and l'Adroite Princess, that although, as in the case of Prince Marquesan and Le Dauphin, in my former volume, I have not included them in the body of the work, I think it may be as well, as in the above instance, to give in this place an analysis of their plots, they being undoubtedly two of the oldest fairy tales of their class on record. Peau d'Ane. A princess, in order to escape the persecution of the king, her father, on a point of conscience, consults a fairy, who is her godmother, and by her advice successively requests her father to give her 3 dresses, the first of the colour of the sky, the second of the colour of the moon, and the third of the colour of the sun, believing he will be unable to fulfil his promises. He succeeds, however, in procuring for her the 3 dresses, and she is then instructed to ask him for the skin of a marvellous ass in the royal stables, which supplies the king daily with an ample quantity of gold coin, under the impression that his Majesty will never consent to such a sacrifice. The infatuated monarch, however, does cause the ass to be killed and flayed, and the princess, on the receipt of the skin she has requested, is reduced to flight. The fairy tells her to put the 3 fine dresses and all her jewellery, etc., in a large trunk, which by magical power is to follow her underground, and appear whenever she needs it, and begriming her face and hands, and wrapping herself up in the ass's skin, the princess escapes from the palace, and travels into the dominions of a neighbouring monarch. She there obtains employment in a farm as a scullion and keeper of the pigs and poultry, her only pleasure consisting in occasionally locking herself up in her miserable room, and putting on her fine dresses and jewellery, which appear at her wish, as the fairy promised her. The son of the king of this country happens to visit this farm occasionally as he returns from hunting, and one day peeps through the keyhole of the door, and sees Peau d'Ane, as the princess is called from the only dress she wears in public, arrayed in one of her richest robes. He is dazzled with her beauty, and believing her to be some divinity, he is afraid to burst open the door, and returns to the palace, where he falls perfectly love sick, refusing to eat, drink, or take any amusement. He inquires who lives in that wretched room at the farm, and is told an ugly, dirty kitchen wench, called Peau d'Ane, for the reason aforesaid. He declares that nothing can cure him but a cake made by her hands. After all sorts of expostulations, they yield to his wishes, and Peau d'Ane is ordered to make a cake for the prince. She has seen him on his visits to the farm, and is equally in love with him. She makes the cake, and drops, by accident or design, a magnificent emerald ring into it. The prince devours the cake, and finds the ring. He immediately declares that he will marry no one but the woman who owns that ring. On this determination being made public, all the unmarried ladies in the court and kingdom endeavour to fit on the ring, but it is too small for any one to pretend to the ownership. At length Peau d'Ane is sent for at the prince's wish, and dropping her hideous ass's skin, appears in magnificent attire, and places the ring easily on her finger. Everyone is astonished, and the prince and her parents delighted, and the nuptials take place, being honoured by the presence of kings and fairies from all quarters, and specially by the father of the princess, who has recovered from his infatuation. The story, founded originally on the legend of Saint Dupin, was a favourite in France from an exceedingly early period, and was versified by Perrault, and published with Les Souhaits Ridicules, as I have already stated, in 1694. He alludes to the original nursery tale in his Parallèle d'Ancien et de Moderne in 1689, in which he makes the Parisian of the ancients say, "Les fables Mélusines sont si puériles que c'est leur fait assez d'honneur que de leur opposer nos contes de peau d'âne et de la mère d'oie." The prose version of this tale was not published until many years after his death, and is supposed by Baron Walkenäer not to have been his composition, and I think there is a point unnoticed by the Baron which supports that opinion. The story is dedicated to Mademoiselle Eleanor de Lubert. Now, if this be Mademoiselle de Lubert, author of La Princesse Caméléon, etc., she was not born till some years after the death of Perrault, and as in the dedication we find the lines "Qui honi voi soyez l'auteur du printemps de vos jeunes ans." The dedication itself could not have been written much before 1720, Mademoiselle de Lubert having been born about 1710. There is another story in the Contes aux Joyeux devisé de Bonaventure Despériers, Novel 130, of a young girl named Peau d'Ane, and how she got married by the means furnished her by the aunts. A gentleman fell in love with a merchant's daughter, named Pernette. The father and mother, not daring flatly to refuse their consent, attached to it what they considered an impossible condition, namely, that for a given period previous to her marriage the girl should wear no other apparel than the skin of an ass. Pernette, returning the gentleman's affection, was not to be discouraged by this obstacle, and cheerfully wore the skin of an ass for the appointed time. Foiled in this manner, they set their wits to work to invent something more impracticable. They insisted that she should lick up grain by grain a bushel of barley, which they split for that purpose on the ground. Nothing daunted, she applied herself to this task, but the ants repaired to the same spot, and took away all the barley by degrees, without being noticed, so that it appeared as if Pernette had done it, and her parents considered further opposition useless. The girl obtained her husband. The story concludes with the assertion that vrai et coûtant qu'elle vescut le sobriquet de Peau d'Ane Louis de Mera. There is nothing whatever in this story to remind one of the last beyond the simple circumstance of the skin, nor have we any clue as to which may be the oldest. But both were called Peau d'Ane, and it may be just possible that one furnished a hint for the other, or indeed that there was a collection of stories so entitled, for Lepart, the valet of Louis XIV, tells us, in his Memories, that when that monarch was still a child, but had passed from the hands of females into those of men, he could not go to sleep. Pourquoi on le lui contait pour les contes de Peau d'Ane, ainsi que la femme qui le gardait avait costume de le faire? L'adroite Princesse, ou Les Aventures de Finette. A king departing for the Crusades commits to a fairy the charge of his 3 daughters, Nonchalante, Bilbarade, and Finette, names descriptive of their characters. They are shut up in a tower without a door, and furnished with 3 enchanted distaffs of glass, which they are told will break on the commission of any indiscretion. They were to be provided with everything they might properly require by means of a basket let up and down by a crane and pulley fixed on the top of the tower. The two eldest princesses soon became weary of solitude, and one day pull up in the basket an old beggar woman, nonchalant, hoping she will be her servant, and Babillarde being anxious to have somebody else to talk to. The beggar woman proves to be a prince disguised, the son of a neighbouring king, who is a bitter enemy of the father of the three princesses, and who has had recourse to this expedient in order to revenge himself for some insult or injury he has sustained. By flattering the foibles of the two princesses who introduced him into the tower, he succeeds in causing them to break both their distaffs, but all his artifices are foiled by Finette, l'adroite princess, who gets rid of him by making him fall through a trap door into the ditch under the tower. Enraged at his defeat, he has recourse to another scheme, and succeeds in inducing Finette to descend in the basket to procure assistance for her sisters, who are suffering from the consequences of their indiscretions. He seizes Finette, and is about to have her rolled down a precipice in a tub filled with spikes, when she adroitly flings him into it, and he suffers the fate he had projected for the princess. Mortally hurt, he bequeaths his vengeance to his brother, who swears to him that he will marry Finette, and murder her on the night of his nuptials. She, however, places a figure of straw in the bed, which the prince unwillingly stabs, and is only too delighted to find he is not guilty of murdering a woman he loves, and who becomes his happy queen. This story was not published till 1742, when it was printed as Perrault's, although it was well known that Mademoiselle Lheritier, who had read Perrault's Histoire du Temps Passé in manuscript, had conceived from them the idea of trying her hand at the same sort of composition, and had actually published, in 1695-6, this very story, under the title of Les Aventures de Finette, in her Livre Meslay, with a letter to the daughter of Perrault. Speaking of that very story, she says, "Vous savez que dans le conte de Finette, les deux sœurs sont très éloignées d'être aussi vertueuses que je le fais en le par point de mariage, que sont deux indignées personnes de qui on raconte de fabuleuses odieuses avec les circonstances choquantes." And she also observes, "J'ai pour moi la tradition qui met ce conte de Finette au temps de croisades." There cannot surely be more evidence required to refute the assertion of Mr. Dunlop, that L'Adroite Princess, be it written by Perrault or Mademoiselle Lheritier, is taken from Le Pentamerone, with little variation of machinery or incident. The story he alludes to is the fourth of the third day, and is entitled Sapia Licardia. There is no such name as Finette in it, and is well known, independently of Mademoiselle Lheritier's declaration, that Le Conte de Finette was one of the oldest of the French nursery tales. Nor can we desire cleaner evidence of the way in which these stories were written than that which is afforded to us by the repeated acknowledgments of Mademoiselle Lheritier. "Ce que je viens de vous dire est toujours au fond bien évident, tel qu'on m'a conté quand j'étais enfant." And again, "Cette fois ma nourrice en ma nuit m'a fait ce beau récit près de Tesson. Je n'ai fait qu'ajouter un peu de broderie. Let any one compare these lines with these of the concluding portion of the story of L'Indroit Princesse, commencing Voilà, Madame, etc., and they must be struck by the singular resemblance. There will be many general readers, and perhaps some critics, who may think I have been unnecessarily minute in my notes and humble attempts at illustration; but whilst I feel that the fairy tales I have selected contain in themselves nothing that may not afford innocent entertainment to children, I certainly hope that the little information I have been able to collect respecting some hitherto obscure and disputed points may give both this and the book that preceded it an interest in the eyes of elder readers, who may meet, where they least expect it, some fact or suggestion, trifling in itself, but furnishing a clue to more important matter. My principal object has been, however, in this volume, to disabuse the minds of those who have taken for granted the assertions of our historians of fiction concerning the original sources from whence Perrault and Madame d'Aulnoy in particular derived the plots of their fairy tales, assertions which I confess I had not thought necessary to notice until, in a kind of and complimentary review of my former volume, it was publicly regretted as an omission. I trust I have now made it perfectly clear that whether or not the writers of those tales were cognizant of the existence of the collections of Straparola and Basile, of some half dozen meagre and garbled versions of stories told for ages in all the tongues of Europe and Asia, that the real foundation of those of Perrault were the old Breton contes de la Mère d'Oie, which in company de Peau d'Ane et de Fir de la Brasse et les cent autres vieux fatras, he had heard in his own nursery, and with Louis XIV had been rocked to sleep when a child, as well as all the rest of the children in his dominions, and that Madame d'Aulnoy, when not indebted to similar recollections, drew upon her own fertile and lively imagination, introducing occasionally an incident from one of the old Trouvères de Languedoc, or some of those oriental stories which were circulated in manuscript long before their publication by Galland, or picked up by herself during her residence in Spain from the Moorish and Turkish slaves around her, nay, from her own little servant Zaid, who, though she could speak no language but her own at the time her mistress so pleasantly describes her, might have eventually acquired sufficient French or Spanish for such a purpose. Her account of this child is so interesting that I shall not apologize for quoting it. They have here great numbers of slaves who are bought and sold at high prices. They are Moors and Turks, some of them worth 400 or 500 crowns apiece. You are extremely well served by these unhappy wretches. They are far more diligent, laborious, and humble than other servants. I have one that is not above 9 years old. She is as black as jet, and would be reckoned in her own country a wonderful beauty, for her nose is quite flat, her lips prodigiously thick, her eyes of red and white colour, and her teeth admirable in Europe as well in Africa. She understands not a word of any language than her own. Her name is Zade. We have got her baptized. Those who sold her to me said she was a girl of quality, and the poor child will come often and fall down on her knees before me, clasp her hands, cry, and point towards her country. I would be willing to send her thither if she could there be a Christian, but this impossibility obliges me to keep her. I would fain understand her, for I believe her to be intelligent. All her actions show it. She dances after her fashion, and so pleasantly that she affords us much entertainment. I make her wear white patches, with which she is mightily taken. She is dressed as they are in Morocco, that is, in a short gown almost without any plaits, large shift sleeves of fine cloth, striped with different colours, like those of our Bohemians and gipsies. A pair of stays made of merely a strip of crimson velvet on a gold ground, and fastened at the sides with silver buckles and buttons, and mantle of exceedingly fine woolen stuff, very long and very large, in which she wraps herself, and with one corner of it covers her head. This dress is very handsome. Her short hair, which looks like wool, is cut in several places, on each side like a half moon, on the crown in a circle, and in front like a heart. She cost me 20 pistoles. My daughter has made her governess of her marmoset, the little monkey given to her by the Archbishop of Burgos. I assure you Zédé and the marmoset are capitally matched, and understand each other extremely well. Relation du Voyage en Espagne. With this characteristic and suggestive extract from a book deserving to be better known, I leave a subject to which it is not likely I shall return in print, though it will never cease to interest me in the study. End of section 47. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, B.C. End of 24 Fairy Tales by Various. Translated by James Planché.